History books often tell us that the fall of nations is always announced by the deafening roar of artillery. They say that the clash between empires is written in fire and steel, echoing across vast battlefields under a burning sun, leaving scars upon the earth that last for centuries. But tonight, as the world outside your window slows down, we are going to open a very different chapter of time. A chapter where the most profound geopolitical earthquake of the modern era did not begin with a grand declaration of war or the march of 1,000,000 men. It began with a whisper in a dimly lit room. It began with the quiet rustle of paper money inside a worn leather briefcase. Now, I want you to make yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket up just a little higher over your shoulders. Let your body sink heavy into the mattress. Release the tension holding your jaw tight, and let your breathing mirror the slow, steady, and endless rhythm of a pendulum. Close your eyes and let the darkness behind your eyelids turn into a canvas. Let me take you back over 70 years, across oceans and continents, to a very specific, quiet moment in time. The year is 1953. The air, in Washington, D.C., is thick with the suffocating humidity of an East Coast summer, heavy with the smell of old tobacco, polished mahogany furniture, and the quiet, creeping paranoia of the early Cold War. Men in perfectly tailored suits sit in shadow-drenched offices, looking at maps of the world spread out on large oak tables, treating entire continents as if they were fragile pieces on a global chessboard. But halfway across the world, in the heart of the Middle East, the night breeze carries a completely different scent. It is the sweet, intoxicating, and slightly melancholy fragrance of night-blooming jasmine drifting through the ancient, narrow alleyways of Tehran. The Persian sky above is vast, an ocean of crushed velvet scattered with cold, indifferent stars that have watched civilizations rise and turn to dust for thousands of years. Beneath this magnificent sky, a nation is resting, completely unaware that their destiny is currently being rewritten in a language they do not even speak. In those early years of the 1950s, Iran was a country holding its breath, standing on the delicate threshold of a beautiful, terrifying new dawn. For generations, this ancient land, the proud cradle of the Persian Empire, had felt the heavy, suffocating grip of foreign powers. The British Empire, with its vast machinery of industry and war, had laid its cold, mechanical hands upon the oil fields of Khuzestan. For decades, they had been drawing the black blood of the earth from Iranian soil to fuel their massive dreadnoughts and light their sprawling, foggy cities, while the people of Iran watched in silence from the dusty, impoverished margins of their own homeland. But the winds of change, carrying the scent of rain and revolution, had finally begun to blow through the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains. A man had risen among the people, not as a conqueror, but as a voice of the soil. He was an elderly, aristocratic statesman named Mohammad Mosaddegh. He did not carry a sword. He did not wear the heavy, gold-braided medals of a military general. He was a fragile intellectual, a man of the law, who often conducted the complex affairs of the state while resting in his bed, wrapped in a simple woolen blanket, his voice trembling with emotion. Yet, this fragile man carried the accumulated weight of a nation's longing. He spoke of sovereignty, he spoke of dignity, and with a stroke of a pen, he did the unthinkable, something that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Europe. He nationalized the Iranian oil industry. He took back the immense wealth of the earth for the children of the soil. It was a moment of profound, intoxicating hope. If you could wander through the grand bazaars of Tehran in those days, walking slowly past the merchants, meticulously folding their intricate silk carpets, listening to the tea sellers pouring dark, steaming liquid into small glass cups, you would feel an invisible electric current in the air. The people walked a little taller. The heavy shadows of the past seemed to retreat into the corners. They believed, with a beautiful, heartbreaking innocence, that the era of empires dictating their fate was finally over. And in this fragile, golden moment of awakening, the people of Iran looked across the globe, not with hatred, but with a profound, almost childlike admiration for a young, powerful nation across the Atlantic Ocean. They looked at the United States of America, to the Iranian intellectual sitting in a dimly lit cafe in Tehran, smoking a cigarette and reading the morning paper. America was not the enemy. America was the great liberator. It was the land of the free, the heroic nation that had once cast off the chains of the British crown, a shining beacon of democracy that championed the right of every nation to choose its own path. They genuinely believed that Washington would understand their struggle for independence. They believed that the architects of the American dream would stand shoulder to shoulder with them against the aging colonial grip of London. It was a psychological reliance built on the purest, most naive of ideals. The Iranian political psyche of 1953 was open, trusting, and deeply vulnerable. They had lowered their historical defenses, stepping out from the heavy fortress of their ancient skepticism, offering a warm hand of friendship to the new giant of the modern world. They did not realize that in the cold, calculated, and terrifying game of global hegemony, beautiful ideals are merely the wrapping paper for ruthless pragmatism. They did not know that their fragile dream of independence was viewed by men in distant rooms not as a triumph of human liberty, but as a dangerous vulnerability, a mathematical error on a geopolitical balance sheet that needed to be corrected. The night deepens over the snow-capped Alborz Mountains, casting long, purple shadows over the sleeping capital. The tea houses have slowly closed their heavy wooden doors. The stray dogs have curled up to sleep in the warm dust of the cobblestone streets. The entire nation of Iran is wrapped in a peaceful, quiet slumber, dreaming of a tomorrow where they are finally the masters of their own house. But history is rarely kind to those who sleep with unlocked doors. While the citizens of Tehran rest, lulled by the gentle rustle of the sycamore trees in the cool night wind, in a secure, windowless room thousands of miles away, a different kind of quiet has settled. It is the rhythmic, mechanical quiet of a typewriter striking paper. It is the sound of a classified document being finalized, a document bearing the official seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, a document titled Operation Ajax. The butterfly is about to flap its wings. The butterfly flaps its fragile wings. But in the unforgiving theater of international espionage, this movement is not a delicate occurrence of nature. It is a calculated, metallic vibration in the intricate web of global politics, sending invisible shockwaves across the oceans. The execution of Operation Ajax did not begin with the deafening roar of fighter jets tearing through the clouds, nor did it start with the heavy, rhythmic marching of foreign infantry divisions storming the ancient beaches of the Persian Gulf. The destruction of a nation's democratic dream began with something far more subtle, far more quiet, and ultimately far more devastating. It began with the quiet, solitary arrival of a single man. In the suffocating, blinding heat of August in 1953, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a senior officer of the Central Intelligence Agency and the grandson of an American president, slipped silently across the border into Iran. He did not bring heavy artillery. He did not bring fleets of tanks. He brought heavy, unadorned, leather suitcases. If you were to sit in the quiet darkness of a basement room in Tehran during those long, oppressive summer nights, you would not hear the sound of weapons being loaded. You would hear the crisp, dry rustle of paper. Inside those heavy leather cases lay the physical weight of American ambition. $1 million in untraceable cash. Piles of green banknotes, bound tightly with rubber bands, carrying the faint, metallic scent of fresh ink. In the grand, sweeping arc of human history, empires have spent unfathomable amounts of gold to conquer territories. But here, in the shadows of the Alborz Mountains, a relatively small sum of paper money was about to be used to purchase the soul of a sovereign nation. The strategy was not to attack the walls of the city from the outside, but to quietly poison the water supply from within. The cold, crisp banknotes flowed silently from the hands of foreign agents into the deepest, darkest corners of the Iranian capital. The money moved like black water slipping through the cracks of dry earth. It found its way into the pockets of ambitious military officers who felt ignored by the new civilian government. It slid across the wooden tables of dimly lit printing presses, buying the loyalty of journalists who began to churn out venomous, fabricated articles. The rhythmic, mechanical clanking of the printing machines working late into the night became the new heartbeat of the operation, slowly replacing the hopeful pulse of the nation with the heavy, dark rhythm of manufactured chaos. They did not just buy words, they bought violence. The crisp green paper was handed over to the leaders of street gangs, to the desperate men from the impoverished southern slums of Tehran, men who would swing a heavy wooden club or throw a jagged piece of brick for the price of a day's meal. The quiet, jasmine-scented nights of Tehran were slowly, systematically replaced by the harsh, abrasive sounds of artificial unrest. Imagine the sudden, jarring noise of a heavy stone shattering the fragile glass window of a tea shop. Imagine the chaotic, terrifying echoes of paid mobs chanting angry slogans in the narrow, dusty streets, their voices amplified by the sweltering summer heat. The air grew thick with the smell of burning rubber from tires set ablaze on the cobblestones, mixing with the metallic scent of fear and confusion. The people of Tehran, who had just begun to taste the sweet, fragile nectar of self-determination, were suddenly thrown into a vortex of orchestrated madness. They watched in silent, paralyzed horror as their streets were turned into a theater of violence, unaware that the script was written in a distant, air-conditioned room across the globe. In his modest home, wrapped in his simple woolen blanket, the elderly Prime Minister, Mohammad Mosaddegh, sat quietly as the tide of history turned against him. The fragile intellectual, who had dared to stand up to the empires of the old world, now found himself surrounded by the chaotic noise of his own people, bought and paid for by the empire of the New World. When the military tanks finally rolled toward his residence, their heavy iron tracks crushing the asphalt beneath them, they were not foreign tanks. They were driven by his own countrymen, but the fuel that powered them was foreign betrayal. The physical coup was swift, ending in a matter of days. Mosaddegh was arrested, his voice silenced, his dream of a free, independent Iran locked away behind cold iron bars. But the true tragedy of August 1953 was not merely the fall of a government. Governments fall all the time in the long, exhausting river of time. The true tragedy was a psychological rupture so deep, so profound, that its bleeding has never truly stopped. On that sweltering summer day, the Iranian people did not just lose their prime minister, they lost their innocence. They watched the nation they had admired, the nation they had viewed as the great, shining beacon of democracy and liberty, reach across the ocean and plunge a cold, calculated dagger into their backs. The psychological armor of the modern Iranian state was forged in the agonizing fires of this specific betrayal. A bombed city can be rebuilt in a decade. A shattered bridge can be reconstructed with steel and concrete. But the destruction of trust is a permanent alteration of a nation's soul. The deep, lingering trauma of the Ajax operation taught the collective Iranian consciousness a dark, unforgiving lesson about the nature of the modern world. They learned, through the bitter taste of defeat and humiliation, that vulnerability is a death sentence. They learned that the smiles of foreign diplomats are often just masks, hiding the cold mathematics of power. Ironically, the architects of the coup sat in their distant offices, drinking whiskey and celebrating what they believed was a masterful stroke of geopolitical strategy. They believed they had successfully secured the oil fields and ensured a loyal ally in the Middle East for generations to come. They did not realize the monumental weight of their actions. Because the great paradox of history is this: the very operation that the United States believed would help them control Iran forever was the exact moment they lost the Iranian soul permanently. The dust of August 1953 eventually settled over the sprawling city of Tehran. The broken glass was quietly swept away from the cobblestone streets, the burnt tires were cleared from the grand avenues, and the harsh, unnatural screams of the paid mobs faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. The young monarch, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country in fear, returned to his ancient throne. He stepped off his private airplane onto the sun-baked tarmac, wearing a pristine military uniform covered in glittering medals, surrounded by men in sharp suits who spoke English with a heavy Washington accent. To the outside world, to the politicians reading intelligence briefs thousands of miles away, order had been restored. The problem had been solved. The geopolitical domino had been forced back into its proper place. But history is not written on the surface of things. History is written in the deep, unseen currents of human emotion. The decades that followed the fall of Mossadegh were a strange, contradictory era for Iran. On the surface, it was a time of blinding, artificial light. The new government, flush with American financial backing and the massive, uninterrupted flow of oil revenues, embarked on a dizzying campaign of forced modernization. If you were to walk through the affluent northern districts of Tehran during the 1960s and 70s, you would feel as though you had been transported to a European capital. The air there smelled of expensive French perfume and imported gasoline. Sleek, polished American automobiles cruised down wide, newly paved boulevards lined with imported sycamore trees. Inside the grandiose walls of the Naivaran Palace, the air conditioning hummed a quiet, luxurious tune, keeping the desert heat at bay, while crystal chandeliers cast long, elegant shadows over floors made of imported Italian marble. There were grand parties where champagne flowed like water, where foreign dignitaries and Hollywood stars danced to the loud, brassy sounds of Western jazz bands, completely isolated from the ancient soil beneath their feet. Perhaps the most surreal illusion of this era occurred in 1971, in the ancient, ruined city of Persepolis. The Shah decided to throw a massive celebration to mark 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. In the middle of the unforgiving, arid desert, an entire city of luxurious silk tents was erected. Hundreds of private chefs were flown in from Paris. Blocks of solid ice were transported across continents just to chill the wine of foreign kings and queens. It was a dazzling, spectacular display of wealth and power, a cinematic dream meant to project an image of absolute, unshakable stability. But underneath this glittering, fragile crust, a long, dark winter had descended upon the Iranian soul. The prosperity of this new era was not a shared warmth. It was a cold, exclusive fire burning behind high iron gates. For the vast majority of the population, living in the dense, labyrinthine alleys of the southern bazaars, the air did not smell of perfume. It smelled of stale bread, damp earth, and an unspoken, thickening fear. The price of the American-backed stability was the complete eradication of political dissent. The instrument of this silence was a secret police force known as SAVAK. Trained by foreign intelligence agencies, SAVAK became the invisible, terrifying shadow that haunted every corner of Iranian society. The vibrant political debates that had once filled the tea houses during the Mossadegh era were completely extinguished. A suffocating blanket of paranoia fell over the nation. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit cafe in the bazaar. The air is thick with the sweet smoke of water pipes. The sound of merchants haggling over spices is a low, rhythmic hum. But suddenly, the wooden door creaks open, and a man in a plain grey suit walks in. Instantly, the conversations die. Eyes drop to the floor. The clinking of tea glasses stops. A heavy, metallic taste of terror coats the back of everyone's throat. Because in this new, modern Iran, a misplaced word, a frustrated sigh, or a forbidden book could lead to a midnight knock on your heavy wooden door. It meant being dragged into a windowless room, where the only sounds were the dripping of water and the heavy, dull thud of a rubber truncheon against human skin. This was the environment that incubated the profound anti-American sentiment of the modern Iranian state. It was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a slow, agonizing compression of grief and humiliation. For 26 long years, the Iranian people watched their resources flow outward, while their ancient culture was aggressively pushed aside in favor of a hollow, imported modernity. They felt like strangers in their own ancestral home, hostages to a monarch who seemed to answer only to a distant superpower. But here is where we must understand the unique psychological architecture of the Iranian nation. If you are letting your shoulders relax right now, letting your breathing slow down, and if you listen very closely, you can almost hear the ticking of a countdown clock hidden beneath the surface of those decades. You see, America is a young nation. Its history is measured in centuries, its culture built on rapid action and immediate solutions. If a problem arises, the American instinct is to fix it quickly, often with overwhelming force. Iran is fundamentally different. Iran is the heir to a civilization that measures time in millennia. They possess what geopolitical scholars call imperial memory. When your ancestors have watched the armies of Alexander the Great burn your cities to the ground, when your grandfathers have survived the terrifying, apocalyptic invasions of the Mongol hordes, you develop a very specific survival mechanism. You learn the profound, devastating power of patience. The Iranian people did not break under the pressure of SAVAK. They simply retreated. They pulled their true thoughts, their culture, and their simmering anger deep into the impenetrable fortress of their own minds and into the cool, dark sanctuaries of their mosques. They engaged in a form of psychological hibernation. In the ancient Persian game of chess, known as shatranj, the most dangerous pieces are often the ones that do not move for a very long time. They sit quietly on the board, absorbing the tension, watching the opponent aggressively push their pawns forward, waiting patiently for the exact moment when the opponent overreaches. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, while Washington celebrated its brilliant control over the Middle East, the Iranian people were silently playing shatranj. They were gathering their strength in the shadows, passing whispered stories of Mossadegh's betrayal from generation to generation, turning a political grievance into a sacred, unyielding myth of resistance. The pressure was building inside a sealed iron container. The American architects of the 1953 coup believed they had buried the Iranian desire for independence. They did not realize that they had merely planted a seed in very dark, very fertile soil and watered it with 26 years of bitter, silent tears. The winter of 1978 descended upon the Iranian plateau with a bitter, unforgiving cold. The snow fell heavily over the jagged peaks of the Alborz Mountains, quietly blanketing the sprawling metropolis of Tehran in a suffocating layer of pristine white. For 26 years, the nation had been held in a state of suspended animation, frozen under the heavy, glittering boot of an absolute monarchy and the terrifying, invisible gaze of a secret police. The American architects of the new Middle East believed they had successfully paved over the ancient, unpredictable soul of Persia with asphalt, concrete, and the intoxicating promise of Western modernity. They believed the ghost of 1953 had been thoroughly buried beneath the foundations of their towering embassies and luxury hotels. But beneath the frozen surface of the earth, the pressure had finally reached its absolute, terrifying limit. The containment vessel, built on decades of silenced voices, forced disappearances, and a deep, festering national humiliation, simply could not hold any longer. The revolution did not begin as an organized military campaign. It began as a low, rumbling vibration in the collective chest of millions. Imagine standing on the edge of a massive, snow-covered avenue in Tehran during those long, dark winter months. The silence of the night is suddenly broken by a sound that shakes the very dust from the buildings. It is the rhythmic, overwhelming sound of millions of footsteps marching in absolute unison, the sheer physical weight of the human tide moving through the freezing streets. Men, women, children, the wealthy merchants from the northern suburbs and the impoverished workers from the southern slums, moving together like a massive, unstoppable river of black cloth and breathless, freezing air. They had stripped away their fear. They had looked into the abyss of SAVAK's torture chambers and decided that the pain of living on their knees was finally heavier than the terrifying uncertainty of standing up. When the Shah finally fled the country, boarding his luxurious Boeing 707 for the last time, leaving his grand, marble palaces completely empty, the pendulum of history swung back with a devastating, inescapable force. The dam had broken, and the floodwaters were heading directly toward the very symbol of their 26-year nightmare, the American embassy. If you were to close your eyes and listen to the echoes of November 1979, you would not hear the sophisticated negotiations of diplomats. You would hear the heavy, metallic screech of massive iron gates giving way under the relentless physical pressure of thousands of bodies. You would hear the frantic, desperate sound of paper shredders working at maximum capacity inside the embassy walls, turning highly classified documents into a meaningless blizzard of white confetti, floating down onto the cold, damp concrete like artificial snow. When the American diplomats were blindfolded, their hands tied with rough cloth, led out into the blinding light of the courtyard by young, furious students, it was not merely a hostage crisis. To the Iranian psyche, it was a profound, deeply necessary act of historical exorcism. They were looking directly into the eyes of the superpower that had orchestrated the 1953 coup, and they were delivering a chilling, unspoken message. The era of the puppet masters is over. You will never, ever decide our fate in a dark room again. This brings us to the very edge of the abyss, to the ultimate question that defines the modern geopolitical landscape. How does a regional power, economically strangled and diplomatically isolated, continue to stand completely unafraid before the military colossus of the United States? How does Tehran look at American aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and fleets of stealth bombers, and simply refuse to blink? The answer lies in the deep, impenetrable armor they forged in the aftermath of their revolution. The United States operates on the overwhelming logic of physical dominance, hard power, the ability to project massive, devastating force anywhere on the globe within a matter of hours. But you cannot use an F-22 fighter jet to bomb a memory. You cannot use a guided missile to destroy a nation's capacity to endure suffering. Iran realized, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that they could never win a conventional war against the masters of the sky and the sea, so they simply refused to fight one. They took the entire battlefield and dragged it down into the shadows, into the confusing, murky, grey zones of the Middle East. They embraced the doctrine of asymmetric warfare. They looked at their own geography, the massive, unforgiving wall of the Zagros Mountains, and turned it into an unassailable fortress. These are not just hills. They are jagged, terrifying teeth of solid rock, stretching for hundreds of miles, creating deep, inaccessible valleys that have swallowed invading armies whole since the days of the Roman Empire. Deep inside these mountains, buried hundreds of feet beneath solid granite, in absolute, echoing silence, lie their subterranean missile bases, safe from satellite surveillance, safe from bunker-busting bombs, waiting with the cold, mechanical patience of a trap. But their greatest weapon is not made of steel or uranium. It is a psychological doctrine built on the concept of strategic depth. The leaders in Tehran do not play the American game of quick, decisive victories. America is a nation that operates on the frantic, 4-year cycle of political elections. The American public loses patience quickly. They want immediate results, clean wars, and fast resolutions. Iran, drawing upon its deep imperial memory, operates on the timeline of generations. They do not rush. They weave a complex, invisible web of proxy forces, militia groups, and political alliances, stretching from the dusty streets of Baghdad to the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon and the jagged mountains of Yemen. They fight indirectly. They absorb the economic sanctions, the assassinations of their top scientists, the suffocating isolation. They watch their currency plummet and their economy bleed. Yet, the system does not collapse. It holds, rigid and unyielding, because the leaders and the core supporters of the state look at the crushing economic pain of today, and they compare it to the profound, humiliating pain of August 1953. And in their collective, traumatized consciousness, they have made a chilling calculation. The agonizing pain of starvation, of isolation, of living under the constant shadow of war, is still infinitely lighter than the pain of surrendering their sovereignty to the West once again. They have turned their trauma into a shield. They have transformed their historical paranoia into a complex, terrifying strategy of survival. They sit quietly in the dark, absorbing the heavy blows of the modern world, waiting with the terrifying, endless patience of a civilization that knows empires eventually exhaust themselves. As the complex, heavy machinery of modern geopolitics continues to grind its gears in the daylight, let us step back into the quiet, comforting embrace of the night. Let us leave the sterile war rooms of Washington and the tense, heavily guarded underground bunkers of Tehran. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing alone on the ancient, wind-swept plateau of Mavdasht, under a canopy of 1,000,000 cold, glittering stars. Before you stand the towering, magnificent ruins of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. Listen to the sound of the desert wind. It is a slow, mournful, and incredibly peaceful sound. It sweeps across the cracked, sun-baked earth, whispering through the broken limestone columns that have stood here for 2.5 millennia. These stones have witnessed the absolute zenith of human power, and they have witnessed its inevitable, quiet return to dust. Think about the immense, terrifying armies that have marched across this exact patch of soil. Alexander the Great, with his legendary Macedonian cavalry, came here burning with the fire of youth and conquest, reducing these great palaces to ash. The heavy, disciplined legions of the Roman Empire clashed against the Parthian archers on these borders. The apocalyptic cavalry of Genghis Khan swept through these valleys like a dark, unstoppable storm, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. And later, the sophisticated diplomats of the British and Russian empires sat in their elegant rooms, drawing arbitrary lines across the map of this ancient land. Where are they now? The great kings who called themselves the masters of the universe, the emperors who commanded millions of men, the generals who believed their military doctrines would last forever. They are all gone. Their invincible armies have dissolved into the sands of time. Their grand, terrifying empires are now nothing more than paragraphs in dusty history books, read by tired students under the dim light of a library lamp. But the land remains. The jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Zagros Mountains still pierce the clouds, completely indifferent to the flags that flutter in the valleys below. The ancient rivers still carve their slow, patient paths through the rock. The night-blooming jasmine still releases its sweet, intoxicating fragrance into the cool evening air, just as it did 1,000 years ago, and just as it will 1,000 years from now. When we look at the bitter, seemingly endless conflict between the United States and Iran through the vast, unforgiving lens of historical time, it begins to lose its sharp, terrifying edges. It is no longer a definitive clash of ultimate good and evil. It is merely a fleeting, temporary friction between a very young, energetic superpower trying to assert its dominance and a very old, deeply scarred civilization trying to protect its ancient pride. It is just another brief chapter in the long, beautifully tragic story of human ambition. So, if you are lying in the dark right now, carrying the heavy weight of your own daily struggles, if your mind is racing with anxieties about tomorrow, about your career, your relationships, or the seemingly insurmountable obstacles in your own life, I want you to take a deep, slow breath. Hold it for a moment, and as you exhale, let all of that tension dissolve into the night air. Because if the greatest empires the world has ever seen can rise to touch the sun, only to quietly fade back into the earth, then the worries that keep you awake tonight are also temporary. The conflicts that seem so massive and terrifying in the daylight are truly just grains of sand slipping through the fingers of time. The universe is vast, and time is an endless, patient river. You do not need to fight the current tonight. You do not need to defend any fortresses or win any battles. You only need to rest. Let your breathing sink with the slow, eternal rhythm of the earth. Let the quiet darkness wash over you, carrying away the noise, the fear, and the complexities of the modern world. If this journey through the shadows of history has brought you a moment of peace, a moment of quiet reflection, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave your heavy thoughts in the comments below and let them go. Close your eyes now. Surrender to the quiet. Have a beautiful, dreamless sleep, and we will meet again in the echoes of the past tomorrow night.